In April 2022, the Florida Department of Education rejected 41% of new math books, citing references to critical race theory among the reasons. In a statement, the Florida Department of Education said it rejected publishers' attempts to indoctrinate students. Of the 41% of rejected textbooks, 21% were rejected for incorporating prohibited topics or unsolicited strategies, including critical race theory. Another 11% were rejected because they do not properly align with Florida's benchmarks for excellent student thinking standards. In an interview with the Chicago Defender, activist and former educator Matthew Kincaid speaks about the Florida math ban, the misuse of the term critical race theory, and why these actions by the Republicans and other conservatives are dangerous.
Well, my name is Matthew Kincaid. I'm the founder and CEO of Overcoming Racism. Overcoming Racism is an organization that seeks to support institutions envision and actualize anti-racist change. And because for some reason, people don't know or understand what anti-racism now, racism is bad. Anti means we're against it. And so if you want to know the baseline of what it is that we do, is that we work to reduce racial disparities. We work to make environments equitable for all people, especially the work that we do in schools in terms of making schools work for children of color. So in terms of my background, I've been doing this work since I was about 14 years old. It's a long story for another day. And as I said earlier in the interview, what really drove me to found this organization was supporting the work of my students, recognizing the multiple types of genius that I saw coming in my building every single day in my school that I worked at, but recognizing that it seemed like we only celebrated and elevated a very narrow set of what it meant to be, quote unquote, good at school. And so school runs off of this very simple social contract. You know, if kids sit down and be quiet and do what the teacher says, give up some basic rights and freedoms, then in exchange, students get educated. Sounds good. But over and over again, if we look at students of color, students in the LGBTQI plus community, students who are born into poverty, students who deal with trauma, students who have closer proximity to inexperienced teachers, where Black and brown kids are 2 times more likely to have a first-year teacher in their classroom. We know that the social contract doesn't work for these kids. And instead of fixing the system, which is what my organization aims to do, oftentimes that same list of kids that I just gave are also the kids that just face greater discipline infractions. Those are the kids that are more frequently pushed from the school system to the prison system. And so our goal as an organization, both in schools and in corporations and nonprofits, is to say, the people aren't the problem, the systems are the problem. Let's fix the systems.
This is insanity that I feel like we're getting hit on every single side. And as we talk about what the GOP is doing in bits and pieces, is slowly chipping away at our right to vote, our right to learn accurate history, our reproductive rights. It's just a dismantling. And these conversations and these new debates about teaching accurate history or teaching accurate math. Can you talk to me about this textbook ban for those that are unfamiliar with what's happening in Florida right now?
Yeah, let me first start by just like giving a simple definition of critical race theory, because that term is kind of at the center of all of this. And I feel like most people are not aware of what that term is. So I'll define the term in the simplest ways that I can, and then kind of shift into how this term is being very intentionally misconstrued and misappropriated to pass some of the most regressive laws passed in what I believe to be the history of this country. And we know what this country has done in the past. So I think that these laws are on par with laws that were passed in the 1800s, 1700s, and 1600s. So we know in this country that the law has been used to uphold racism. I mean, that has been evidenced in pretty much every institution, from education to healthcare to voting access. You listed many of them. And so in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was a group of legal scholars who got together to think about, well, if the law has been a principal vehicle that has been used pretty effectively to maintain racism, how can we also envision the law as a tool to dismantle racism? And that is how critical race theory was born. The goal of critical race theory is simply an analysis of how the law can be used to facilitate anti-racism, used to dismantle racist structures that historically have been upheld by the law. It is a fundamentally positive thing. It should not be something that is political, that people are against. It's not, some anti-white inquiry. Actually, critical race theory makes very compelling arguments about how white supremacy is bad for all of us, and how by ending white supremacy, we would all be enfranchised, especially white people who are poor. But that's a whole nother conversation for another day.
Yeah.
What effectively has happened is that, politicians have always found that stoking racial fears amongst white voter bases has been an effective electoral strategy. A lot of people can point back to like the Southern strategy with the Nixon administration. This is kind of a modern incarnation of that. And so politicians have whipped up this fear that critical race theory is being taught in K-12 school environments all over the country, and it's indoctrinating our children, and it's going to create a dynamic where white children won't feel comfortable in schools. And so many states, I believe there are 25 states that have legislation moving through the process. I believe there are 15 states that have already passed legislation, and the most far-reaching legislation is the one that is in Florida, because it doesn't only dictate what can be taught in schools, but also dictates what even private corporations can do to educate their own employee base. Like, for example, our organization can no longer do work in Florida, because in Florida it's illegal to call racism systemic, and it's illegal to allude to the fact that we should be racially conscious and racially aware versus being colorblind. Wow. And so the irony, which is really super quickly, about Florida making it illegal to call racism systemic, is that a group of white men coming together to determine what is racist and what is not, and then pass a law that dictates who can teach about race and who cannot, is evidence that racism is systemic. But the law itself makes it illegal to say that.
That makes
I know. It's truly nonsensical.
Now, how does that even pertain to a math ban? Like, I'm trying to understand the logic in that. Can you kind of break that down for me?
Well, it doesn't. And if you try to find the logic in what's happening right now, then your head is going to hurt, because there isn't logic in what's happening right now. The state of Florida, if you're unaware, recently did a review of their math curriculum, and 41% of the math textbooks were rejected because either they were found to promote critical race theory, the big boogeyman that everyone's talking about now, or social emotional learning strategies, which is really just learning strategies that also engage with students' emotions and the social environments and habitats that they exist in, which is also a fundamentally positive thing. And so for people who reviewed these textbooks, they have not, of course, found critical race theory in these textbooks, because once again, critical race theory is a relatively obscure legal theory. And last time I checked, legal scholars aren't writing elementary math textbooks. Now, there were some instances in some of these textbooks of textbooks showing data or graphs about racism. Well, if you need a kid to learn how to read a graph, probably would be a good thing for them to learn how to read a graph that also talks about racial disparities. Some of these textbooks highlighted, let's say, Black mathematicians or mathematicians of color, et cetera. And so what is happening here is that because critical race theory isn't being taught in schools, but laws are being passed to ban it being taught in schools, you now need evidence that it is being taught in schools. And so in a lot of ways, this is just a fictionalized narrative that this is in the textbooks, when people who review the textbooks can't find any of these dynamics. It's just as made up as the actual definitions of critical race theory that these politicians are using to try to ban. What they're really trying to ban is the teaching of critical history in our school settings, and also the acknowledgement that racism has impacted disparities that come out as a result of unequal education, which has been true for the entire history of this nation.
Yeah. Now, how does that affect educators? Like, what are educators supposed to do if their teachings could be criminalized?
Well, and I think that's the point. I think the laws like this aren't really about the letter of the law. It's simply about injecting enough confusion into the populace, the parent base, such that when it's Black History Month and a teacher sends home a project about Dr. King or Ella Baker or whomever, that a parent reads it and says, this is critical race theory. And, then takes action to the school or the school board or the principal or whatever the case may be. We've also seen Black school leaders in districts that are mostly white being targeted. In Texas, there was a school leader who was fired for promoting critical race theory. And once they did a review, they found that he wasn't promoting critical race theory, but he was still let go. Superintendents in predominantly white environments as well. I mean, in a lot of ways, if you're a person of color in these environments, you are now on trial for whether or not you're subversively, promoting critical race theory. We saw what happened in the recent Supreme Court confirmation hearings, in which, I don't think in Justice Brown Jackson's entire career, anyone's ever questioned her about critical race theory. But now all of a sudden, she's the critical race theory candidate or the critical race theory justice solely because she's a Black woman. And so really, it's just another attack on, not only Blackness or people of color more broadly, but just the notion that we could teach anything that would contradict the traditional narrative of this country's history.
And that they can use the term CRT to really mean whatever they want.
Whatever they want. Sure.
Wow.
And the term and what they use it to mean shifts. Because first, this is being taught in our schools, and now this is, the Supreme Court justice is promoting this. And now what they found is that it's been a very effective strategy to drive out voters, just like stoking a fear about immigration caravans that never came, or these different dynamics. Like, this is the new thing that you must be afraid of this so that you can vote for us. Oh, our election security is compromised. We have to pass these laws to make it harder for people to vote because there's all this fraud that's not really happening, but we're going to say it's happening. You should be afraid of it, as a guise to do really reactive things like what's happening in the Supreme Court now around reproductive rights. I think that a lot of what's happening in these schools is going to be a precursor to, other rights that have been fought for generations and generations falling by the wayside because, folks are promoting these false narratives.
Through fear. It's a scary time. Can you talk to me a little bit about your book and what made Overcoming Racism and why you felt the need to write this book at this time?
Yes. Well, I founded Overcoming Racism to support organizations. Initially, schools was the major focus of our work. We expanded to healthcare organizations, nonprofits, corporations, et cetera. Be able to both envision and actualize anti-racist change. I used to be a social studies teacher in New Orleans. I taught 7th and 8th grade social studies. I was a school administrator at that school as well. And I saw on a daily basis my students coming into school and doing the things that we asked them to do. I taught at Holly Grove, New Orleans, a 99% African-American student population, but facing significant obstacles both outside of school and inside of school. My first full week of teaching, I lost 2 students to gun violence, and these kids were 13 and 14 years old. And so what I recognized was that the reason why we were seeing disparities in achievement wasn't because there was something fundamentally broken about the kids that I was teaching. Actually, it was quite the opposite. These kids changed my life in ways that, we'd have to have several interviews to even scratch the surface of what just knowing these young people, how they helped me to grow as a person. I learned that these young people were not deficient, but the systems that they were forced to navigate on a daily basis were. And teachers were coming into these school buildings with good hearts and good intentions, but did not always have the skill set to understand how to dismantle racism, both in their courses, curriculum, but also in the way that we engage and taught our kids and engage with the community. So that's why I founded Overcoming Racism. The reason why I'm writing the book is to support educators with applying the theory of anti-racism to actual teaching practice. Because what we find is that when students are in schools that are culturally affirming, they do better. And so, if we can elevate this idea that the kids aren't the problem, the system is, then we can actually start to change the systems that we're forcing students into. Well, I'm extremely honored. Obviously, the story legacy of this publication and just to be a part of that is a huge honor. If I could just say one more really quick thing just about the arc of this whole CRT dynamic, I think one of the most disheartening things about what we're seeing happening in our country right now that your viewers and listeners should be aware of is that if you think back to a few summers ago, the tragic murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and, the shooting of Jacob Blake and all those different dynamics, we saw for, a month or so, this country that seemed to be willing to finally address, centuries and centuries of racial pain and harm. People ran out and they got books and they listened to podcasts and they educated themselves and they said, never again, we are going to face this thing head on. And what we're seeing now is unfortunately the very predictable set of backlash to that, where we didn't necessarily see the policy change as a result of all of our activism, but we are seeing policy change on the other way, one, to both make it harder to protest, but also to even make it harder to teach about these dynamics in schools, make it harder to vote. This impending ban on women's reproductive rights doesn't just impact women's reproductive rights, but you're also talking about women's access to the employment sector. You're talking about access to wealth. This ripple effect is significant. And like everything else, like this pandemic, everything else is going to hit our community the hardest. And so, I just want to kind of name how important it is that we're vigilant about all of these things. Because it's not always about what's happening right now. It's about the impact of what's happening right now in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And what will be made of our community if we can't educate our children, if we can't vote, if we don't have autonomy to control our bodies. We're very aggressively marching back to some very scary times in this country for people of color. And so for everyone who put a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard or bought a t-shirt or read a book, this right now is what you were supposedly preparing for. And how we respond in this moment is going to dictate the country that our children inherit and our children's children, et cetera. So.
This is Danielle Sanders reporting for the Chicago Defender and Real Times Media.